Serious. Redditors who believe in the paranormal, what convinced you it's real? What convinced me was I saw it happened, and my cousin saw it with me. Was cruising through some rural areas in my cousin's car, I wanna say 1 or 2 a.m., weren't smoking or drinking, just having a nice cruise. Went on this road that went through some heavy woods, but we did it before so we had no fears. It was dark of course, no moon, with just a slight sprinkle of rain. We were coming to this part in the woods where there was a street light, but it was an old light, was dimming out. There used to be an old building there, but was tore down, but the light stayed up for a few years. Mind you, this was very rural. No one lived nearby for maybe 20 miles, so it was extremely rare you pass another car, let alone another person. At this time, it didn't help that the locals said stay out of the woods at night. I was just looking out my window at the woods when we were coming up to the light. Next thing I know, the car does a movie turn, like stomp the brakes, do a 180, and fleabing burn rubber the other way. I get weirded out and look back through the car. I see the road illuminated by the streetlight and see this massive black figure beside the road. It takes one step and it's in the middle of the road, another step and it's already on the other side. Immediately, I look forward scared out of my mind, look at my cousin, see intense fear on his face. We don't say a word to each other and he drops me off. I stay up till sunrise and finally go sleep. Funny now that I think about it, we never talked about once, not after it happened. But yeah, we saw Bigfoot, as do the locals who tell similar stories. When I was in 4th grade, I just moved into my dad and stepmom's house. My sister and I slept in bunk beds. Hers being the bottom and mine the top. The bed rested against the wall with the door at the foot of the bed. One night, I'm sleeping at the head of the bed and I wake up and hear some weird noises. At first I think it's my sister, but I poke my head down and see that it's not. Something compels me to look out the door and into the hallway. I scoot down to the foot of the bed and stick my head out the top of the foot frame and face my parents' bedroom door that is across from mine. I look to the floor and there is this pitch black human-looking thing on the ground. I don't know what I did, but it noticed me and it scuttles or crawls fast across the floor and up my bunk ladder, and I just remember seeing black. I remember waking up that morning at that same spot of the bed. If anybody has an idea of what this is, it would help a lot. I moved into an apartment building after getting my first job at 18. Over the years, I've been in all of the apartments in that building, but I only ever rented 2. Creepy things happened all the time. We mostly just brushed it off as old pipes, faulty wiring, drafts, etc. The place was built in the late 19th century, it made sense. There was one time that I actually came face to face with what I can only assume was a ghost, and I never went back in that building again. It's weird, when your brain sees something it knows can't possibly be there. In that moment, something in my mind just snapped, and I was overwhelmed by absolute instantaneous pants-pissing dread. All over a face, in a hole, in a ceiling. A face that, after making eye contact, backed into the darkness as if retreating into shadows that simply weren't there. It's been 11 years and I can still see it. It had no eyes. Just black sockets. Gaunt face, drawn lips, and no teeth in its mouth. It looked afraid. And it was white. So white. There was no sound in that moment. I remember that too. This thing didn't move. It was just there and then gone. I don't know what it was. I know nobody would sleep in that room. I know that after seeing this thing, I climbed down off of the chair and walked out of that apartment, never to set foot inside again. I know that now, I still get creeped out even walking past that building. When I was younger, I used to collect porcelain dolls. My mom was a huge fan and would often bring me some back from Mexico. The dolls would move out of the corner of my eye, sometimes appear in new places I hadn't placed them. Eventually I got rid of my entire collection out of fear. But this isn't about the dolls. Around 10 years old, my aunt used to drop her kid off at random hours of the night so she could party freely. I remember many nights waking up and seeing my young cousin crying standing next to my bed waiting for me to acknowledge her. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and saw the outline of a small girl with long curly hair. I spoke out to her, thinking it was my cousin. I told her to come to bed. But she was unmoving. The outline stayed there, staring at me. Eventually I went back to sleep, still under the assumption it was my kid cousin acting up. The following morning I went into the kitchen searching for my cousin. I remember asking my mom where she was at, and she told me my cousin never came by that night. I never believed in the paranormal until a few years ago. I was using an Ouija board with a few friends, and it wasn't the first time I had ever used one. In the past nothing ever happened, it was obvious that we were the ones moving the slider, and it was something that we used to make fun of each other. But this time was different. It was very different from the beginning. There was a strange feel in the room, and something I had never felt before and haven't felt since. When I took the slider, I was moving it, but it felt as if I wasn't alone. The slider proceeded to move in ways I was not moving it, and after a few quick seconds, it began to spell out the word, leave. I told my friends something was going on, and they all thought I was kidding and trying to mess with them. Then the slider, moving on its own now, spelt out, now, and we all were freaked out. Before any of us could do anything, a flower pot in my friend's living room flies off its table about 4 feet and smashes to the ground. We shuffle to put the board away and go outside, and as we are going outside, my friend screams and is claiming something hit him. When we get outside, all freaked out at what just happened, he lifts up his shirt and realizes a handprint on the center of his back. I have never used an Ouija board since, and have never doubted the existence of the paranormal since that day. Driving home from my parents' house last winter, around 9 p.m., no other cars on the road. I was flipping through the radio stations, probably not paying as much attention to the road as I should have been, trying to find something interesting to listen to. I looked up from the radio and see what I thought might be a blue plastic bag or something on the road just ahead. My eyes fixated on it as I tried to stop. It looked completely still and surreal, like really dense and really calm smoke, completely motionless. ABS kicked in, but I couldn't stop in time. I didn't hear a thud, but I got out to look anyway. This is in rural Maine near a college. It's really not uncommon to see wildlife in the road, especially with trash from the college. I've seen raccoons with bags stuck on their heads, dogs carrying around trash bags, all sorts of critters. I wanted to make sure I didn't hit one, so I got out to check. I looked all over outside. No tracks on the road besides my own tire tracks. No footprints. I had to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was steam from a storm drain? Not many storm drains in the middle of nowhere, Maine. I looked all over the road for an explanation. Finally, I shined my light over towards the woods, and I was stopped. I kid you not, directly next to a cross on the side of the road was where a pedestrian had been hit and killed a few years ago. Immediately, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my entire body tingling. I got out of there pretty quick. I have plenty of stories from my mom's house. The most notable was the time I went down in the half-finished basement to get something. I was 12 at the time and it was around 8 p.m. As I was walking from the finished part to the unfinished part, I felt to find the switch for the back room. When I flipped the light on, to my right there was a young boy, 4 years, standing 3 feet away staring at me. The horrible part about it was he was all gray with red eyes. He didn't speak, and his face had an evil expression. I turned around and ran up the stairs so fast without looking back. I stayed in a house where the previous owner's wife was a heavy smoker and died from lung cancer. Normally when it was just my friend and I, we would come in and greet the ghost in a friendly way. One weekend that we stayed there, we brought extra company, and I don't think she appreciated them in her home. During dinner one night, there were 4 of us sitting around the table. There was a window on one side that had those long vertical blinds, and one of my friends sat with his back to the window. Suddenly mid-conversation, the 3 of us facing the window saw what looked like someone walking by the blinds and running their hand along them. At that same moment, my friend, whose back was to the window, jumped up and yelled, "Something just touched me on the back of the neck." It all happened within seconds, and there was no way he would have seen what we just saw behind him. That same weekend, the door to the garage would randomly open and shut. We had been staying at this place all summer and never went in the garage. It was just storage, so we kept it closed and locked. One evening, I opened a can of cinnamon rolls to bake, came back after preheating the oven, and a bite had been taken out of the raw dough. Nobody owned up to this, but just odd timing of it all. The weirder part was, I was the last to bed and the first one up. When I woke up, I noticed that the fridge magnets had been rearranged. Originally the whole fridge was covered in magnets, but not organized in any way. I looked closer and there was now one front and center of the woman who died and her kids, and the rest of the magnets surrounded it. Last thing from that weekend was we didn't smoke inside the house at all, but I had taken a picture in the kitchen, and when I got the film developed, it looked like my friend had a double exposure of cigarette smoke surrounding him. This was just the beginning of my odd paranormal experiences in my life, but it definitely made me a believer. My best friend's aunt died under some fairly mysterious circumstances when we were younger. It took several days for anyone to realize they hadn't heard from her, so her body was left in her house several days. Fast forward to when I was 15 and he was 17, it was late one night in the summer and we were hanging out at his house. The three of us, myself, my brother and our friend, were discussing the paranormal and similar themes, and Brian told us about how he was convinced that it was all real because of some stuff he saw happen in his aunt's old house a couple years earlier. He convinces us to ride down to her old house and check it out, see if anything creepy happens. 45 minutes later, we arrive at the house. It's been nearly 10 years since anyone lived there, so everything is choked out by weeds and tall grass. Brian grabs a bag of flashlights and a video camera, and we walk up onto the front porch. At this point, my brother loses his nerve and goes back to the car. Brian and I continue toward the front door and I feel it. A heavy, freezing cold presence just in front of the door. Even though it was a summer night in North Carolina, still pushing 90 degrees, I had goosebumps all over my body. It took some coercing on Brian's part, but I went inside the house with him. We immediately turn on all the flashlights and he fires up the video camera. He's telling me the story of how he and his dad stayed here for a few weeks after his parents got divorced, and I start to lose my cool. The biggest part of the story was how he woke up in the middle of the night to see a tall silhouette standing in his doorway. Thinking it was his dad, he doesn't mind. When the silhouette turns to leave, he rolls over to go back to sleep. Instead, he decides to get up and grab a glass of water. He walks down the hall and sees the silhouette heading into his dad's room. Young Brian decided to follow it, still thinking it's his dad. Instead, he reaches the door to see the shape pressing a pillow over his dad's face, trying to smother him. He yells and turns the light on, and the shape disappears. So at this point, I'm already pretty convinced there's something there. But we press on, and Brian sits down at the kitchen table. He asks his Aunt Linda to let him know if she's still here, and we wait. Maybe 30 seconds go by, and one of the cabinet doors slowly opens. Unconvinced, Brian asks her again to tell him if she's here. The hall closet door slams open, and two more kitchen cabinets open. I'm finally done. I grab my flashlight to go, and the storm door of the front of the house slams shut, and my flashlight went out. And that's the night I decided that there was definitely some truth to it. I go camping and multi-day hiking as a hobby. I've been stalked by a mountain lion before and have been hopelessly lost 100 miles from anything, so I know the woods. The weirdest thing I've ever heard was a wailing in the night. I DK what this thing was, but I woke up around 2 a.m., my fire had died and there was an overcast, so it was pretty much completely dark. I was camped in a ravine-like valley, cutting through the mountains of Tennessee. This noise was in the valley coming right at me, from some distance over 500 yards. It really sounded like a man yelling in deathly agony. If you've ever heard somebody's yells who are passing due to trauma, that is how it sounded. It's an odd thing and unsettling to describe. Anyways, I was lying in the dark, gun in hands while this thing was getting closer and closer. Within 300 yards, it stopped wailing and left me in silence. A couple minutes after it stopped, I could hardly make out a figure in the dark about 25 yards to my right. Whatever it was tall, at least 5 feet, and it was moving roughly west to east at a pretty good pace, making absolutely no noise as it went. It seemed to be gliding along, there was no lateral movement with this thing. It just went by and I heard it wail a couple more times far down the valley. The next day I checked for tracks and didn't find any of significance, just old deer tracks. I still have no idea what could have made that noise. It was hauntingly human and sounded extremely distressed. I still don't believe in the paranormal, but that definitely made me question it. I've had a lot of undeniable instances over the course of my life: shadow figures, objects taken and replaced, smells, voices, etc. I've never really felt threatened though. Most recent events have all taken place in my mother's house. It's a nice thing in a suburban area, built back in the 70s. I've seen a few things in there that have convinced me more than anything, but only one account of something has been confirmed by the both of us. There is something in her house that will mimic both of us, but never mimics her boyfriend, who actually lives with her, while I only used to spend a couple nights of the week there. The first and only instance I caught wind of it was one night when I was dropped off to spend the night before work the next day. My mother lives closer to my second work location, so a few nights a week, I'll stay at her place. She and her boyfriend are in the house flipping business, so they spent a majority of last year being at the house. They were flipping every night of the week after he got home from work at 6. Point being, whenever I came around, I was always home alone. One night, I get dropped off and I open the front door while my back holds open the storm door because I was struggling with my night bag. I leave the door open while I bend down to grab my night bag, and I hear my mother's voice in the front of the house with me. She's saying something as I'm bending down, but it sounds so distorted and low that it sounds like she's sick, and I even catch a glimpse of her in her pajamas, straightening her house robe before I bend down. When I look back up and ask her what she had said to me, she's not there. I'm confused, as she would have had to literally sprint down the hall for me to not see her anymore. I walk inside with my stuff, set it down, and begin looking for her around the house. Her little Yorkie hears me and comes running while I look. I check the entire rest of the house, there is no one home at all. I'll never forget how her voice sounded to me, exactly the voice of my mother, but so otherworldly at the same time, like a video of those cats' dogs that sound like they're talking. A few weeks later, my mother told me that one day, she and her dog were sitting in the den when she suddenly heard my voice from the front of the house, amiably calling for the dog. The little dog heard it too and came running as commanded. It wasn't a day that I usually come over, so my mom got up to come greet me, except, of course, I wasn't there. She was alone, and she told me that even the dog had started to act a little strangely when it ran to where it heard me.